So this organization does a variety of services, but my story is rooted specifically in foster care and adoption. That's really the cornerstone of what my experiences with supervised visitation really began. When I was a toddler, I was removed from my birth mother, who incidentally was a 16-year-old girl living in foster care in a group home herself when she got pregnant with me. She later turned to the people who gave her food, shelter, housing. Unfortunately, those people were the drug dealers and the pimps and the people who did not progress her life in a positive way. And subsequently, as those statistics will say or predict, my brother and I ended up in the foster care system where I spent nearly 10 years bouncing home to home to home. I ultimately had 14 different placements, and I later learned that more than 25% of my caregivers were or became convicted felons. So sadly, I was placed in homes with people who had problems with drugs, alcohol, violence, pedophilia. So I had a pretty frustrating childhood. And families utilize visitation centers for a multitude of reasons. In my situation, these havens would have been perfect for me to have the opportunity to have visits with my birth mother. And my birth mother also struggled with relationships in her own life. So having a place like this would have been helpful as she was navigating those interpersonal relationships of her own. Meanwhile, here's a kid just sort of stuck in the middle of all of this. So these programs provide opportunities for safe exchanges for children whose families have experienced some sort of upset or perhaps divorce or some source of contention. These are spaces where foster children like me might have the opportunity to be in a safe place to see members of their families of origin who maybe are struggling with some issues of their own. And so while my mother's life spiraled in and out of control, my brother and I lingered in the foster care system. And it meant that we were moved without much notice. I changed schools at least twice a year until the 7th grade. And all of those moves are incredibly difficult and incredibly frustrating. And really, just the moves alone, it's not even necessarily being in out of home care that's the most traumatic. It's the constant moving and upheaval and changes in relationships and communities and rules and dynamics. It's completely overwhelming. But you can probably imagine, I don't know if it's a redhead thing or what, but I was a pretty darn stubborn little kid. And so I was in these abusive situations, and I really just couldn't help this feeling that just something wasn't right. This didn't feel okay. And one of the most difficult homes I was in had 16 kids sharing 2 bedrooms in a trailer. And we were beaten, starved, locked outside, forced to swallow hot sauce, like all kinds of crazy weirdness. And in this home, it was sort of survival. And my younger brother was almost killed in this home. They tried to drown him. So I went to school and I started telling my teachers and my counselors and pretty much any adult that would listen to me, I would tell them what was going on in this home. And fortunately, educators are mandated reporters. So they sparked investigations. But unfortunately, so many of the other kids in the home were so terrified to admit what was really happening. So I was branded a liar and a troublemaker. And those kinds of labels, especially on children who come from untraditional circumstances, those kinds of labels can trail us for the rest of our lives. There are so many preconceived notions about who foster children are, or what we can achieve, or why families in general end up in these circumstances to begin with. Why would a family need a program like this? Well, my story is one such example. And unfortunately, I was removed from this home for causing too much trouble. So I went to the next home and I was telling them what happened. Sadly, the state had allowed them to adopt 8 of the children that were in that home. And for so many years, I was so angry and frustrated because I couldn't understand how people could lie and cheat and hurt children while kids like me were just thrown out like trash. But justice came in a very interesting little package. We're going to fast forward a little bit because we really only have about like 30 minutes together, and I got a whole lot of story to pack into a little amount of time. So just come along for the ride. It's going to get a little crazy. I actually have like ADD in real life, so I'm kind of all over the place and I'm a lot to handle. So it's probably for the better that I'm behind a screen and there's a little bit of a threshold, because half of you would have no idea what I'm talking about in real life. But anyway, buckle up. Here we go. So now I'm a teenager. And I'm sitting in the living room with my adoptive parents, and we're watching the news. Up on the screen pop 2 mugshots. Who were they? I'm so glad you asked. They were the foster parents in that really icky home that I was just describing. They had been arrested on over 42 counts of felony child abuse with torture. So finally, there was evidence that somebody was listening to the children. So often, children who come from vulnerable circumstances, they fall through the cracks with no one to speak for them, with no professional to have eyes on them, with no prospect to get help and be seen. And that was very much the situation for me. But when this happened, I ran up to my adopted parents and I was like, you guys, check this out. This is amazing. We've got to say something. We've got to do something. Now, my adoptive parents are wonderful people, but I have to level with you because they are also the biggest hippies I have ever met in my life. So I ran up to them and I'm ready to storm the castle and make a difference. And their response was, oh, Ashley, let's just hug it out. Why don't we just process some of this in therapy? And I was like, no, you crazy old hippies, this is the real deal. So unfortunately for them, around that same time, I had just seen a little film called Aaron Brockovich. And so I was like, hey, I want one of those class action thingies. There were so many kids in and out of the foster care system. And I knew that there were so many other families being impacted by a variety of these issues. And I knew we weren't the only ones. And I knew there were so many other kids in foster care. So I pestered and pestered and pestered. And my parents finally contacted a child's rights attorney who looked at the material and said that this could be a really amazing opportunity to create change and awareness and really get some systemic overhauls occurring. So that was really exciting to have the prospect of having my story mean something on a larger scale. But selfishly, the coolest part about that experience was that for the first time in my life, I had legal access to all of my case files, which consisted of over 80,000 documents. And these were foster parent licensing files, caseworker notes, school records, my psychological evaluations. And those were some doozies, let me tell you. But I had this unprecedented opportunity to go through all of this material and really see what or who could have made the biggest difference in my life. And I didn't have access to a program like this. Visits with my birth mother or even my brother were very irregular. Sometimes my brother and I were placed together, but more often than not, we were separated. So unless our caregivers at the time were willing to help facilitate those visits, there were periods where I didn't see him at all. There was even a period of around 2.5 years where I didn't see my birth mother. I didn't see my biological mother. I had no idea who my biological father was. I don't know if anyone was even looking for relatives. And so this program is so invaluable because they help maintain those family ties. When children are being thrust around in these circumstances by no choice of their own, unless there is something like this in a community, they may not get to see their family. They may not get to see someone who looks like them. And little things like that may seem kind of silly, but I didn't see another redhead until I was a teenager. And I got to meet some of my cousins after my adoption. It was the first time that I had seen other people that look like me. And little things like that are really incredible. So looking in these files and doing this research, calling the phone numbers, going back through this whole process, I really had this unique perspective to see what were some of the opportunities for change? What are the programs today that could have influenced my story in a positive way and perhaps change the outcome either more quickly or just in general? I ultimately was adopted from a children's home in the Tampa Bay area. And by all accounts, we've had a very successful adoption, except in my book, there's an entire chapter called Testing, Testing, where I pushed every button these people had. But adoptive parents also have supervision. There was a period of kind of this weird courtship where my parents would come to the children's home and kind of meet me and get to know one another. But programs like this are wonderful for all opportunities to help children build relationships, either with existing players in their lives or maybe with new ones. They might be able to meet a prospective adoptive parent in this safe familial space. And that is so important. And these connections are invaluable because no child can successfully become an adult if they have absolutely no idea where they've come from, if they have no idea what their prospects are. And I was really lucky that I was one of those kids who was finally adopted. And for me, adoption meant that I finally had a community and people to rely on. And as silly as it sounds, it meant that when I was in high school, I got to get a yearbook. And what was crazy was that I was in the yearbook. So I was in the same school when they took the picture and then still at that school at the end of the year when the books came out. I mean, that's huge for a foster kid. It meant that when I was in high school, I got to get a driver's license and my first job, and I got to go to prom, and I got to go to college. And when I was in college, I had somewhere to go when my dorms closed for spring break and Christmas and Thanksgiving and Hanukkah, because my adoptive mom is Jewish. So we get to do both. Except my very first Hanukkah was legitimately the biggest ripoff of my life. Hear me out. So I get that she was just trying to teach me the traditions and ease me into this whole thing. I kid you not. This woman gave me one sock one night and the matching sock the next night. And then, as the nights go on, the gifts are supposed to get progressively more impressive, right? So then I would get a pajama set, but the top one night and the matching bottoms the next night. And so I'm like, what's up with this Hanukkah stuff? Oy vey. But it meant that when I got married, I had oh, is everyone getting that feedback? Is that better? There we go. So having that community and having these people who cared about me and made that permanent commitment meant that I had a father to walk me down the aisle when I got married. It meant that I had a mother to hold my hand in the delivery room when we gave birth to our first child. And by we, I mean me. I'm taking full credit for that one. But it means that because I ultimately had this gift of a family, I now have a pop-up and a Gigi for my children, and someone who loves them and spoils them and gives them far too much sugar and sends them home anyway. It's like the ultimate revenge. And I saw earlier there was a grandma who, who was watching her little grands. Don't do it. You will be tempted to send them back full of sugar and not wanting to sleep. I mean, you can do it. That my parents just laugh. They think it's hilarious. They're like, you put us through a nightmare of teen years, and this is your ultimate retribution. So I just laugh at all of these incredible family dynamics that I have now. And the fact that that cycle of abuse, that cycle of poverty and neglect and dysfunction, that is ended with my generation. And my children will never know what it is to be hungry or afraid or question where they're going to sleep at night. Because of programs like this and a handful of dedicated professionals, there are children who will have these positive outcomes, who will be reunified with families, who will have a sense of community and a sense of belonging that is essential to them ultimately becoming productive members of society. No human being can go about this world on their own. But if you think about that cycle of abuse, that cycle of poverty, again, my own teen mother was a foster child living in a group home when she got pregnant with me. So what is a young girl to do who's been trafficked, who's been exposed to drugs, who's, she didn't have a blueprint for what it meant to be a parent. And so often these are multi-generations of dysfunction. And without programs like this, they don't know how to parent. They don't know how to interact with their children. They don't know how to simply exist in parallel with other human beings because they've never been taught. And they feel so much guilt and shame. And they don't put themselves out there because it can be incredibly awkward to navigate these unbelievably complex family systems. So I'm incredibly grateful that I get to meet parents and professionals who are dedicating their lives to bettering families and ultimately bettering entire communities. I would, again, really love for this to be kind of an intimate back and forth. So now that you've had an opportunity to learn a little bit more about my story, and I see some questions kind of popping in, some are coming in privately. So you're welcome to send me a message privately as well as in the general forum. If you want to send it to me privately, there's a little blue kind of arrow with names, and you can click that and send it to me privately, or post a question in the general forum, as is already starting to happen. So the first question is, do you have a relationship with your birth mother and father? I still do not know who my biological father is. I'm very, very fortunate that I have an incredible relationship with my adoptive parents. And so I'm an adoptee who doesn't feel that same void or that same curiosity, but that's not necessarily the same for all adoptees. And I feel tremendous gratitude for my adoption, and adoption was ultimately a very positive thing for me. I'm now an adoptive parent myself. After I was married, my husband and I became foster parents because I think it's really important that you practice what you preach. And my husband and I cared for over 25 children before adopting a child of our own. So now we have 2 biological children, and our eldest is adopted from the foster care system. And we utilize the principle. So again, like how Brad and I met was through the Supervised Visitation Network, and we've utilized so many of those principles in our personal life as we were adopting our child, but also in our professional lives because I'm a licensed clinical social worker in Florida. So I was able to use my adverse childhood experiences to ultimately earn a master's degree in social work and become a licensed practitioner who runs a little agency in my own community providing direct services for children and families. But my mother didn't have access to these kinds of services. And I do have a relationship with her when I feel that she is sober and able to do so. And I think these complicated dynamics, they don't just magically go away. Like, I'm an adult now. I've been told that I'm like a responsible adult, which still, like, I think that's just hilarious. But like, I'm somebody's parent. And like, and this is the scariest part, like, I'm somebody's therapist. Like, whoa. But if people do not have access to these kinds of programs, to these kinds of professionals to model after, they have no idea how to navigate these relationships or even how to greet someone at the door. When families visit these centers, they are learning how to have these exchanges with one another so that they don't end up very bitter and alone, and they don't reject all of the help. And when I became a parent, that was really when my threshold changed and when I learned to create those healthy boundaries. And so we sort of have a rule in my family that no child can ever have too many people who care about them. But in order to be in the lives of my children, the expectations are sobriety and, positivity and some of those elements. So to answer the question about my relationship with my birth family, I am in touch with many members of my family, but it's also kind of awkward for them, simply because my story ultimately has been so widely talked about. And there's the book. All of the names in the book and identifying information has been changed to protect their identities. But it's still super awkward. Last month, I had the tremendous privilege of being named a L'Oreal Women of Worth. The company L'Oreal Paris does every year a Women of Worth program, and there's going to be a special on NBC, I believe December 16th. And so, I mean, if you kind of think about it, again, for my family, it's sort of awkward, like, oh, there's Ashley on TV talking about all the things. So, these continue to be very complicated family dynamics. But again, this is why programs like this are so invaluable. I'm not saying CVP sits here and like talks to kids about how to share their stories on a public platform, but they really help strengthen those relationships and expose children to safety and complexities and perhaps even sides of their families that they haven't gotten to experience before. When families are able to see professionals who know how to just play a game with a child or have a healthy snack or just be in a safe environment for a change, those types of things make a really big difference. And when I say that an environment that a child is exposed to can be life or death, I do not say that casually, because one of the biggest questions that I'm asked shortly after the relationship with my birth mother is, what is your relationship with your brother? Well, my brother and I were in foster care. My brother was in foster care a little bit longer than I was. He was also born very premature and had some cognitive deficits that I fortunately never had. I was born healthy and I did not have a mental impairment or I was not drug affected. And I think that really helped tremendously in my executive functioning and my ability to perform well in school. So there were a lot of factors, but statistically, across the country, 50% or less of the children who are in foster care, and that's just kids who get what it's called adjudicated. So they have a judge that say, yep, boop, you're in foster care. That doesn't speak to the thousands of other families who are struggling, who just maybe slip under the radar or don't make it to that threshold of foster care. But 50% or less of those kids will graduate high school. 3% or less go on to higher education. So those numbers alone show you how vulnerable this population is. And most of the foster brothers and sisters that I had have become teen parents. They've been in abusive relationships. They have had arrests or gotten hooked on drugs, or really have had incredibly difficult lives. And my own brother, a few years ago, died from a drug overdose. So he is a very personal and constant reminder of how critical these interventions are. Because programs like this exist now, kids like me are able to thrive and survive. And I get to be here with you, sharing this wonderful chat and this wonderful energy and synergy of kinship and caring and support. But children like my brother will never see the end of their 20s, if they even get that far. So that is the very stark reality of how critical these interventions are. So by supporting this organization, you are giving a child a chance to live in a community, live as part of a healthy family system, and ultimately become someone who is a part of your community as a peer, as an educator, as a doctor, as whatever they want to be. These kids don't just magically go away. And systemically, if we as a community don't rally around children and families, we're just going to deal with them in the next system of care. And so I personally am forever grateful of the people who sacrifice their time, their treasure, their talent to ensure that children in our own backyards feel seen and loved and are safe. Because you don't have to look far to see a child in need. And by all of you participating in this event this evening, you are showing that you are dedicated to the children and families that you live with, that you are acknowledging the problem. And I'll be honest, child welfare isn't the most glamorous. It's easier to raise money for cute puppies and kittens, and there's nothing inherently funny or fun about child abuse. Like, poor Brad's probably like, hey, let's talk about trauma. That doesn't make for as cute a banner as like a kitten, let's be honest. So these are really hard issues. And because they are so difficult and because they are so challenging, sometimes people feel like, either they say, well, there's all of these systems of care in place that clearly there's something happening for that already. Or they might think that the problem is just too overwhelming. So what can the average citizen realistically do to create change? Well, I can assure you that the biggest changes in my story and my life came at the grassroots level. And across the country, the frustrating part is that there really is no uniformity when it comes to child welfare programs. It is oftentimes individual nonprofits or organizations or groups of people who get together to create change. That's how all of this comes to pass. And these organizations can't exist without the support of their communities. So I'm thrilled to see so many people who have come to this event, who have stepped up for children in your community, because without you, there would be so many other kids falling through the cracks with absolutely no one to speak for us. These children deserve to be seen and they deserve to be loved. And programs like this allow for safe havens for children and families to come together and receive services that are desperately needed to help keep those families intact. I also want to leave time and space for people who maybe are struggling with the typing chat function. Feel free to pop your camera off mute momentarily to ask any questions. So was there anyone that wanted to ask a question like the good old fashioned way by just using your voice?
Hey, Ashley, this is Kyle. How's it going?
Well, thanks. Well, what am I going to say? Actually, Kyle, that's terrible.
Terrible tonight. Well, my question was
awful.
My question was, was it difficult for you to decide to write a book about your life? Like, did you find it difficult where you're like, I'm going to be sharing this story with the entire world? Was that ever a dilemma for you?
Well, first of all, thank you for your question. But the interesting thing, so earlier I mentioned I changed school so often, but the ironic thing was that I learned at a really young age that no matter how horrific my life was around me, my education was something that I was going to have for the rest of my life. It was something nobody could control, nobody could take away. And that was a real safe haven for me. And so going to college ultimately became one of my really big goals. But when I was adopted so late that my parents didn't set a college fund aside for me. So I started applying for scholarships and writing contests and pretty much anything I could do to try to win scholarships to save up for college. And when I was a teenager, about 16 or 17, I wrote an essay for the New York Times Magazine entitled Three Little Words. So it was an essay contest that asked participants to write about a day that was really life-changing. And I wrote about my adoption day. But I wrote about how it wasn't this rainbows and sunshine kind of occasion. It was really terrifying because I had seen kids be unadopted and sent back. Like, that's a thing. You can return children like an outfit that doesn't fit. So I didn't believe in happily ever after. I almost thought this whole prospect was too good to be true. But I wrote this essay, and the three little words are definitely not the words everyone expects them to be. But I happened to win first place. Yes. And from that, the essay was published in the New York Times Magazine. And from that, publishers contacted me interested in hearing my full story. So I was 17 when all of this happened. And so I don't know what I was doing. Are you kidding me? But when something so bananas like that comes across your doorstep, you don't just say, oh, no, thanks, I'm driving. No, you say yes and you figure it out later. So that's sort of what I did with my first book. It came about so quickly and so when I was so young. So I don't think I fully understood the magnitude of what it would mean. Interestingly, my second book, Three More Words, came out in 2015. And that one actually feels infinitely more vulnerable than my first book, because I think I was so far removed. Well, I was a teenager, so you do things and then you think later, like 10 years later, you're like, oh, whoa, okay. So I don't think I fully had a full understanding of the magnitude of what all of it meant. But again, publishing as a more seasoned adult, a second time, the stakes felt very different. And it's about much more current life. And so I think that was a lot more intimidating. But with the first book, it was much like the attitude I had when the lawsuits came about. I was determined and I was frustrated. And I was like Ashley Brockovich, and people are going to know these stories because my story is not unique. It is not the only one. It is just one of thousands. And I have survivors who reach out to me regularly on social media saying that my story feels identical to theirs. And it's given them either the courage to put those pieces behind, or gives them the strength to move forward in some kind of advocacy capacity, perhaps as an educator or a social worker or a foster parent or a CASA, or like the biggest donor CVP has ever seen. And there is just no limit to what these young people are capable of when people are able to harness their pain and turn it into power for themselves and for others. There is little that's more therapeutic and healing than that. So yes, ultimately publishing was completely terrifying, but fortunately the first book came about when I actually didn't have any idea what it really what it really meant. I was just trying to get some scholarships. But now I think I would be completely freaking out, yes. And I see some other questions. What could have been changed about Visitation? What deliverables were missing? Well, I think one of the most detrimental things was that there was no consistency. So there was no consistent place for my parents to even meet. There was no cohesive communication. There was no certainty. There were all of these barriers, not having a physical place to visit and people dedicated to facilitating these visits. My mom just kind of gave up half the time, or the information didn't trickle down that, hey, visits aren't happening because my mother was incarcerated. Sometimes when everything is just left up to a case manager or someone, they may have upwards of 40 cases, and one case might be a sibling group of 5, of whom live in 3 different counties. I mean, that's how bananas this stuff gets. So how does one person even decide where to go? What place can accommodate a family of 5, where the siblings may range from 5 months old to 15 years old? So just logistically trying to figure out where to even go to have this happen safely can be a challenge. What do you meet in a mall that appeals to the 15-year-old, but then you've got the little one like going? I mean, it's not as easy as you would think. Think about planning a family reunion. And that's, conceivably with healthy, capable family members. So these are very, very complicated issues. And so not having any cohesion, any communication was problematic, but also not having trained professionals supervising these visits is problematic, because a trained professional can flag things and help parents learn how to speak differently to their children. They can be taught how to engage and interact, or maybe not criticize. The last thing you want to do, let's say that you're a child who has visitation with your parents. You see your birth family maybe 1 hour a month, depending on what the court says. It might be 1 hour a month that you get to see your family. But what if in that 1 hour, unbeknownst to your birth parent, they're criticizing you, they're putting you down, they're saying, oh, well, why is your hair like this? So having a professional there to help mitigate those circumstances can be really, really helpful, because it teaches even the parents how to have quality interactions. And also, there were so many times that I would show up for a visit somewhere, but my mother wouldn't show up. And so there was, that was just so painful, to be told that something was going to happen, but then it didn't. And sometimes in those instances, it was something that logistically is totally solved by a program like this. So having a more formal package like what we do here, that enables these visits to actually take place, allows for them to be wholesome and cohesive, and also takes a lot of the stress. So my case was in the dependency system, but which is different in Florida than family court, which is more like divorces and not foster care. So in those circumstances, I see a lot of parallels in the dependency system because my birth mother was in incredibly abusive situations. Most of the men that she was with beat her or did drugs. And so as she, as a young woman, at times was trying to separate from those, one of them was the biological father of my brother. Imagine what it's like when you are a young woman trying to piece your life together, but you are in a situation where you're having to share custody with your abuser. So visitation networks and centers like this allow for that kind of safe exchange of children so that there are those cases where parents don't feel safe interacting with one another. And I think that was sort of a big deficit in my story as well, is that if my biological mother had been given even a fraction of the support that was being paid to strangers who incidentally were abusing me, then perhaps she could have gotten our family back together much sooner. And yes, things worked out really beautifully for me, but my brother's dead. And so, sometimes people will say to me like, oh, everything happens for a reason. Isn't this so lovely? And I'm like, I don't think my brother agrees, and where the real change and the real outcomes are going to occur is through that direct service work. And you are directly supporting a program that has daily impacts on the lives of children. And those even small acts of kindness, those small interactions might just be the thing that ultimately saves that child's life. So that is the magnitude and what's at stake here. So I am immensely grateful for all that you are doing personally and professionally to support this organization, because again, our outcomes would be so much more bleak if everyday community members aren't rolling up their sleeves trying to find the solution. So thank you. I know I'm over my time, so I'm like, I know it's okay. But I just want to be able to remind you that in those moments where you might feel like, oh, well, maybe I'm not doing enough, or maybe this isn't making a difference, reflect on stories like mine and remember the why. Remember why you do what you do, because the work that you're doing is saving lives like mine, for which my children and I will be forever grateful. I mean, the most traumatic thing in the lives of my children currently is broccoli. So we've come pretty far. I mean, they think I'm the worst. At the back to school meeting, our 7-year-old looked at his teacher dead in the face and was like, my mom is the worst. And so I'm just like over here, he's like, she makes us clear our entire plate, even the vegetables. And it was just, I'm like, okay, kid, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, like, because my kids are so young, they don't really understand kind of what I do or what my story is. And so like that was just like unspeakable abuse, that I would dare make them eat a plate of vegetables. So thank you for what you do, because with any luck, the work that we're doing collectively will create a world where the most traumatic thing for a child are greens one day.
Oh, thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing a little bit of your story and about the importance of what we do here at Central Visitation. I mean, you really hit on a lot of the components, because what we see with the families we're serving, we are able to provide not only that safe place for the children to see their parent, but especially with the families we see that are going through child welfare, we are able to coach the parent. We're able to help build their skills to make them a better parent, so hopefully those kids can come home. Whether it's coaching in the visit, we offer parenting classes. So there's just a lot of ways that we are trying to improve the lives of children. And I really appreciate you taking the time tonight to talk and share a little bit about the importance of what we do. So thank you so much. A few things. I am, of course, going to plug the silent auction one more time. We've got a few hours. It's coming up on 7, and so the silent auction is going to close at midnight Mountain Time. So please get on and bid. We've got some wonderful items. Of course, we appreciate your support tremendously. COVID and everything associated with it definitely has been hard, especially for a small nonprofit. So the support from the community is so tremendously needed, so we can continue providing the services that we provide. And the last piece of that is we are thanks, Ashley.
Sorry about that.
Distracted me. And of course, we have been able to reopen our volunteer program, so I will do a plug for that as well. For families that are not involved in the child welfare system, that are involved in the divorce court system, or parents had to file a protection order against the other parent of the children, we utilize volunteers to do those visits. And they're always on site in our location with trained staff nearby. But we definitely are working to grow our volunteer program again. We are fortunate, we are requiring everyone to be vaccinated who is on site here, and that allows us to be a little bit less strict with the mask rules. We do wear masks when we're around kids, especially younger ones, of course, but if we do prove everyone's vaccinated, we can be a little bit less strict. And so having volunteers available is a wonderful part of that. The last thing I'm going to ask all of you on tonight is to share the story. We have recorded this and we're going to post it on our website. So I would just ask each of you that's on tonight to share the story with somebody who maybe doesn't know about Central Visitation Program, about the important work that we're doing here in the Denver metro area. So we'll make it as easy as possible for you. You can get on the website and share. And Ashley, yes?
Well, I was going to say, and Brad, what is the most important link or social media handle or hashtag? What are the best ways to share said information?
Oh gosh, that's so helpful. And I see a question. So yes, the silent auction is open to the public. You can share that link with anybody you want. We take donations from anyone. So yeah, anybody who wants to bid, and we'll get the items to you no matter where you are. So our new website address is www.cvpco.org. And I'll let Kyle tell you all the social media handles.
Yeah, I mean, we have major social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You guys can just go on to Facebook and search Central Visitation Program. I'll be posting this video probably later tonight or tomorrow. But again, like Brad said, the biggest thing is word of mouth. You guys are the people that have donated and supported our organization for a very long time. And we are looking for new supporters, and we're trying to spread the word. And it's really, it starts with you guys. And if you can point somebody right to our website or our social media page where they can listen to Ashley's story. Ashley did an amazing job explaining it, and she's actually been through it. So you see the importance of our work, and we just want to get the word out there.
And the last, go for it, Ashley.
Oh, well, I was just going to reinforce that. I mean, again, aside from, your donations of time and volunteering, I'm sitting in California in a hotel room, living like I do this nationally, and I can absolutely assure you that you sharing with your 5 nearest and dearest, it's that grassroots efforts that are going to make that huge change. And never take for granted the power of communication and the power of community. That's really, so please, I would love for everyone on this call to commit to sending an email or an instant message or your favorite vehicle for communication. Send to at least 5 people and say, hey, did you know that we have families right here in our own community that are struggling and need allies and need voices? I mean, it's really, there's nothing more powerful than an email list. So, please, truly tell your friends and family about this work, because that 100%, the organizations can bring in speakers, they can be, do newspaper articles, the struggle is real in this world for disseminating information, but you really have a chance to make a huge difference just by exactly what they're talking about. Reach out to your circle, because that, without question, will always be the most effective way to transform programs. So they know what they're talking about. Totally.
Thank you for affirming that we actually know what we're doing occasionally around here. The last thing I wanted to leave you with, we were chatting at the very beginning, but in addition to the pandemic, Central Visitation Program is also dealing with being dislocated. Our main office building, which is we're housed by Central Presbyterian Church. We're so thankful for the space that they've given us. And they are going through a major capital campaign. And so we have been displaced during the construction. We are hopeful that we'll be moving back in March. And so our next event, we're hoping, will be in person and will be an open house to show you all, because they are renovating part of the 3rd floor to make the office space work for us, to be at a better environment for our families. Just little changes, like the fact the elevator isn't going to open and be looking down the hallway where the kids and the families were interacting, that it'll be kind of around a corner, so the parent who doesn't want to see the other parent, or the foster parent who's picking up a kid from our location, doesn't have to interact with with the biological parent and cause that conflict. So just those little things that's going to improve the security for us, for allowing families access. We're going to actually have a nice front desk area where we can greet people and sign them in, that will be more like what you see at like your doctor's office. So there's going to be a lot of really nice improvements to the program and our space. And so we're really excited about that. So we'll be getting details out probably in the spring about that event, that open house. And we'll invite you all to come and celebrate with us as we move back to that space. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. Again, thank you, Ashley, for sharing your story and taking your time. And we're going to keep it right to an hour, and we're going to let you all go and enjoy your Friday evening. Don't forget the silent auction and to share the story with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ashley.
Bye, guys.
Good night.
So good to see you. Good night, everybody.